balance of power will be decided in the Asia-Pacific. No other region of the world is of greater strategic significance. China's anti-Axis, anti-denial capabilities are already such that they could prevent the United States Navy from operating in the Pacific in the event of armed conflict. Their economy is set to overtake the United States by 2037, and in some measurements, it already has. The United States is diplomatically in decline, while China has taken advantage of the U.S.'s weakened position to take a stranglehold on key Asian allies and strengthen connections with other key nations. Xi Jinping has set the stage for China to become the next global superpower. That is why I will be supporting the motion that this House believes that China is the next global superpower. Now, before we look at the reasons why I believe this resolution is true, let's look at one key definition: global superpower. Global superpower is defined as a state with a dominant position characterized by its extensive ability to exert influence or project power on a global scale. This can be measured in four key ways: soft power, alliances, military power, and economic power. Now, I want you to remember those four key measures as we move on. So now that we know what the resolution means, let's move on to why I believe the resolution to be true: the contentions. In the contentions, I will be going over the four key measurements of a global superpower, comparing the United States and China using them, and showing why, in the end, China has the long-term upper hand. The first contention is soft power. When looking at the U.S.'s soft power, we can see that according to Ronan Farrow, a longtime Department of State worker and now Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, not only under the current administration, but also going all the way back to the Clinton administration, diplomacy has been in decline in power, focus, and funding. This is only accelerated under the Trump administration, as budgets have been slashed and diplomats used for personal gain. Meanwhile, in China, diplomacy is seeing an uptick in power, funding, and focus. China has begun to hire more career diplomats for the purposes of exerting its diplomatic influence on a global scale, just as a global superpower does. Right now, China has the long-term upper hand in soft power. The second contention is alliances. The United States has many alliances, but in recent years they have grown frail. NATO has lost faith in its U.S. allies as they continuously threaten withdrawal, and the leaders of the U.S. bash heads with the leaders of NATO nations. The United States' abandonment of the Kurds has resulted in a sharp decline in faith of the United States, as their allies ask the question, if they abandon them, what's to keep them from abandoning us? Meanwhile, China has begun to solidify its alliances, having a near monopoly on Asia, with even longtime U.S. allies Japan and South Korea beginning to hedge between the two. Not only that, but according to Kira Goldring from Business Insider, she says, quote, China has also taken strong steps to make global connections, trying to solidify relationships with some of America's previous allies. It is also running an effective public relations game, representing itself as a globalist world power, end quote. Here we can see it is clear. China has the long-term advantage in alliances. The third contention is that of military power. Although it is true that the United States currently is the most powerful military in the world, even the United States' own Department of Defense admits that the gap is closing between them and China. China has established itself as a powerful military system, essentially blocking the United States from operating within the Asia-Pacific, and the defensive budget for China is growing with each year, while the United States has reached its long-term capacity already. Not only that, but the People's Liberation Army, the army in China, is in the midst of a military modernization program that is bringing it in line with the organizational structure of the modern Western military and will allow it to vie with the United States for the top spot. Here we can see it is clear. China has the long-time advantage in the military power. The final contention is that of economic power. According to Mark Champion and Adrian Loom of Bloomberg, China is already an economic superpower. At purchasing power parity, which adjusts the value of a dollar for what it can buy in a given country, China now has a larger economy than the United States. The gap is only likely to grow, given that China has far more people making and buying things, and they're likely to get richer than they are today. Meanwhile, the United States' growth is slowing, with GDP growth in the last quarter only reaching a meager 1.9%. China will overtake the United States in economic power. According to Xu Yao in the University of Nottingham China Policy Division, she says, quote, China will be able to maintain high growth, to reduce inequality, poverty, and corruption, to improve production efficiency in the environment. China will overtake Japan to become the second largest economy by 2017, and the US by 2037, and will become another superpower. By 2037, China will also become a world leader of science and technology and have sufficient military and/or diplomatic capability to compete with the United States in maintaining regional and global peace and order. End quote. As we can see from this quote and the previous quote about Chinese economic power, it is clear that when it comes to economic power, China has the long-term advantage. In conclusion, when we look at the four aspects that are required for a global superpower, it is clear China will have them all, and at a greater capacity than the United States in the long term. No other country, not even the United States, can compete with the growth in all sectors that China is experiencing and is expected to maintain. And as the US continues to digress, the gap in growth will only grow. In soft power, alliances, military power, and economic power, China will have them all. China will be the next global superpower. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank the first speaker for mentioning some very interesting points, bringing some things to attention in this important topic, and honestly, ideas that we have to refute, but important ideas nonetheless. Firstly, I'll be refuting, and centrally, I'll be refuting the idea that China will be the next global superpower. I think it's important to hear both sides of the story. And so I'd like to start off by refuting the idea of soft power and China's influence on the world that the first speaker had mentioned. The United States' influence can never really be measured by any particular metric. Diplomacy also has never been a primary focus of the United States. Our foreign policy directive has been primarily based on intervention and militaristic power. So that means that the diplomatic structures of the United States are far less important than that of China's. Multiple secretaries of state have actually acknowledged this, including Mike Pompeo and Donald Rumsfeld, who have served under various presidents. Furthermore, China's diplomatic structure is incredibly bureaucratic and unitarian, which leads me to my second point of refutation. And this is an incredibly important one, and that is that China is actually not seen as a good faith actor in the world, especially by the Western nations, which have its closest diplomatic ties to the United States and have the greatest influence on world politics and beliefs. In other words, most Western nations align with our assessment that identifies China as a threat to Western hegemony. I mean that there's very little room for the diplomatic battle that the first speaker may have wanted to paint. This idea that China will convince our allies to betray us, or to convince them to somehow prioritize China's interests over the United States. China's interests do not align with Western nations, and so we have to be able to divorce those two ideas. Secondly is this idea that China somehow has the upper hand, either geopolitically with our Eastern allies or otherwise. And it's kind of hard to imagine this, considering the most recent studies done by the Pew Research Center, its international division. This research by Pew Research found that 63% of South Koreans, view China unfavorably or even with distrust. And it's hard to imagine that the two countries will cooperate in any significant way outside of basic economic symbiosis when keeping this in mind. This is also very important considering South Korea's economic and militaristic ties to the United States, its geopolitical ties. The first speaker's assertion is further disproven when you look at Japan, which is actually the biggest and most influential power in the region when related to the United States. Only 3% of Japanese people see China with a positive view, with trust, and 85% see it with a negative view, an outright negative view. Now that's very significant because these intangible and yet intrinsic ideas have to be considered when making such a big claim about China's ability to become a next global superpower. Now, with these refutations in mind, I would like to bring up two major reasons as to why China will not be the next global superpower. As I said, I would like to expand on this idea that China is not seen as a good faith actor. So while they may be able to expand and develop their interests in second or third world countries that are still developing or in desperate need of funding or infrastructure, all current Western powers refute this and acknowledge domestically that China is a competitor at best and a threat at worst. Multiple nations have actually acknowledged this, including England, France, Spain, among others. And these ideas actually kind of expand into a greater worldview, and that is that the worldviews of China and the worldviews of the United States are not compatible. For example, just as one example, the United States is a democracy. The majority of Western nations, particularly those of tremendous influence, are democracies. They are representative governments. China is not one. And while it may have its strengths in certain aspects, it's a weakness when compared in terms of foreign relations. A good state actor is usually, or one that can align with Western ideas, is usually not one that is a unitarian party state, a one-party state. And so that should be considered when claiming that the United States and its ties cannot be, or rather that China's ties to Western nations will somehow compete with ours in any significant way. So let China focus on the second and third world countries, the countries of the global south, and let us focus and primarily prioritize our relations with the Western nations, particularly those of the United States, or rather those of Europe. Secondly, I want to talk about the cultural aspects of China that prevent it from being a global superpower, and that is that China is a manufacturing nation first and foremost. Its greatest asset is its mass mobilization of people, not its innovation or its developmental power. China is not an innovative nation. They're actually infamous for intellectual property theft and for buying technology off of foreign nations rather than developing it themselves. And so that means that they outsource the majority of their infrastructural and innovative projects to foreign companies and foreign nationals. Again, they do not do it themselves. And when we talk about a global superpower has to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. It cannot develop ideas or infrastructure or technology dependent on other nations, depending on the charity or otherwise financial recompensation of another nation. It requires its own developmental field domestically. And if you don't have that, you cannot be considered a global superpower. So those two central ideas, again, the idea is that they are not seen as a good faith actor in the global sphere, specifically geopolitically and diplomatically, and secondly, that the cultural aspects of China are actually working against them. It outweighs whatever advances they may have made domestically in terms of their own infrastructure. They outsource their ideas, or rather they import their ideas, and they cannot create their own. And again, that is to their detriment and to our benefit, meaning that the United States will remain the primary global superpower and that China will not be the next global superpower.
I will start by returning back to the foundation of the government's argument, which was the definition which we have provided and then its justification. So the idea is that there are multiple aspects which make up this idea of the global superpower. That means soft power, alliances, military power, and economic power, the summation of which allow for the difference between, let's say, a global player versus a global superpower. So today the government upholds the motion that China qualifies for this title and therefore will be the next global superpower. So why is the definition presented by the government so vital to this case? In his refutation, our opponent stated that a world power cannot be measured by any one aspect alone, of which the government, of course, believes wholeheartedly, because we have already said that all 4 qualities of this definition must be present in order to qualify. This is a very important aspect of our case. The opposition entirely ignores the measure of military power, and then following that provides somewhat weak arguments in regards to how China has not qualified in terms of soft power, alliances, and economics. So let's get into those. My first point of refutation is that China doesn't have to be well liked, but well respected. When we consider any number of world powers throughout history, the Roman Empire, Mongol Empire, British Empire, even the Soviet Union, none of them were particularly well liked, but were able to maintain their dominance in their due time. So therefore, the statistics that my opponent brings up in regards to whether or not China is well liked by other nations like South Korea or Japan, these become less relevant because the well-likeness or like overall opinion does not really qualify as like a justification for this argument. And underneath this same logic, we can actually dismiss the necessity of being a good faith actor, as our opponent likes to coin as like the qualities of what makes a global superpower, as defined by the opponent. But when we look at a different definition brought to us from Clayton P. Gillette from the Duke Law Journal, he defines good faith as honesty in transaction concern. And so, in other words, sincere or genuine international politics, which, under this definition, China clearly adheres. This is because, otherwise, it would lose its political legitimacy, and in terms of economics, China is already winning the race, and so therefore clearly politically legitimate. And so following this, I would like to also follow this with my second point of argumentation, which is that the opponent points out that China is leading in manufacturization, but that China is dependent on other countries for innovation. This is also an overgeneralization, and according to the stat which the government already presented, China will be leading in innovation by 2037. As far as dependency goes, it is necessary, or it is a necessary consequence of growing globalization. If a country even has a chance to become a global superpower, or a chance of this global superpower, it's by its connections and, like, in some ways, dependency on these other countries in order to prove its superiority. So, therefore, the opposition fails to address the entire definition presented by that of the government, and only aspects of it, while the government has justified each of the four aspects and explained how China has accomplished each of them fully. But why is it so important that China qualifies for each of these independent qualities? Because global superpowers are judged by their ability to influence other nations. I repeat, because global superpowers are judged by their abilities to influence other nations. Very important. In order to do so, they have to A, be recognized by other countries, B, have connections to these other countries, C, have a large enough military which can be taken seriously, and finally D, have an impact on a large enough portion of global economics. These are the qualities that we've presented to you on behalf of the government. So most recently, this position has been held by that of the United States in the aftermath of World War II, but as the U.S. decreases in influence, they are being replaced by China, which, without question, is becoming the world's next global superpower. Thank you.
So, to begin, I wanted to thank both the government and opposition for great arguments. And I wanted to start off by talking about a key element of the definition for a global superpower. So, in both the government and opposition's arguments, they talked about how there are four areas that create a global superpower. So there's soft power, there's alliances, there's military power, and then finally economic power. So the key word here being is that global superpower must be strong in all of these four areas. If they aren't strong in all four areas, then they cannot qualify as a global superpower, because even in the name global superpower, it's supposed to mean that they're the best of the best, they're leading the world in innovations, in discoveries, in war, in everything a global superpower is leading. So if they're not strong in all four areas, it means they're more of a global player or maybe a global influencer, but not yet the level of a global superpower. So the strength in all four areas is something that China, unfortunately, lacks. And this leads me to the opposition's argument. So the opposition upholds that China lacks the facilities to become a global superpower. So firstly, I wanted to refute one of the government's arguments. So the government argued that China does not have to be well liked, but rather well respected. While I do agree with this, the problem is China is not particularly well respected. If you look in the news right now, you'll probably see stories filled with Chinese police officers beating protesters, beating innocent Hong Kong protesters, Chinese protesters as well. So this definitely lessens China's respect in the global world. Because all of the global superpowers are westernized nations, and since we that doesn't happen in western nations, or at least it might happen but it doesn't happen where it's approved of. There's usually some sort of backlash. Um, but since there is some sort of backlash, then it's difficult for China to uphold this reputation and standard that the westernized global superpowers all have. And even in areas where China is well respected, such as manufacturing and productivity, it's often undermined by headlines of ecological turmoil and headlines of workers being abused and overworked, and some even dying for all of the work that they're doing. Therefore, being well liked, especially in China's case, can serve to hurt the respect necessary to be a world power, because these things are taking away from China's ability to heighten itself. And secondly, I'd like to refute the government's idea that China's lack of innovation, is a non factor in it becoming a global superpower. So, when America was on the quest to become a global superpower after the 1950s, shortly after World War II, there were numerous innovations that came out of America alongside rapid production. Unfortunately, to become a global superpower, you need to have more than just a bunch of stuff that you're producing, because any nation can increase its production. You need to rather have innovation, rather have new ideas, new knowledge that's flowing out of your country, because this is what leads you to the top and ultimately will keep you on the top as a global superpower. So, overall, while I do agree that China has some areas where it is excelling in, it is excelling, unfortunately, since China is not strong in all four areas that were aforementioned, China will never reach the level to become a global superpower such as America and the UK. They struggle to accept Western ideas, Western ideologies, and they often are head on in controversy regarding their ecological and human rights policies, leading to a collision of the ideas between Western and Asian culture that doesn't always intersect to allow China to fit in the mix of global superpowers that there are currently. Thank you.